Welcome to a discussion on challenges of women studies. Women as a part of societal progression has always contributed towards the societal development. In the process of such developmental contribution, several new issues have emerged and these are differently contextualized and redefined and reinterrogated. Several new processes and new concepts has also emerged in conceptualizing gender issues and women's issues in general. Today, the whole perspectives of defining women's issue and gender issue is being contextualized by the whole processes of globalization, economic modernization and economic liberalization. Women's studies as a distinctive area of societal research has invented and reinvented new concepts and perspectives, and these have thrown open several new challenges not only to sociology but also other sister disciplines in social sciences. To discuss some of the challenges of women studies, we are having among us today Professor Maitri Chaudhary from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Maitri Chaudhary has extensively contributed to the study of women studies in India. She has chaired the Women Studies program in Jawaharlal Nehru University, has been associated with several programs at national and international level on gender and women studies. I, on behalf of the sociology faculty, invite Professor Maitri Chaudhary to the studio. Professor Chaudhary, will you please elaborate briefly, as we understand a new varieties of concept has emerged in Indian society today in comprehending women studies and gender studies, also in identifying some of the issues. Will you please briefly elaborate what are the major issues when you talk about the women's issue? What are the women's issues we are talking about, and how is it distinctive from a societal issue?
I think this is something which you really raised, a core issue, that is the relationship between any social issue and women's issue, because in many ways a women's issue is also a social issue. So why do we address the women's issue in a separate fashion? I mean, this is a question which a lot of people will probably ask, as that why are we talking about women's issues? Is poverty not a social issue? Is unemployment not a social issue? Is bad health not a social issue? So why are we talking about women? This in a certain sense raises a very fundamental conceptual issue which women's studies has been able to raise, the issue about whether any discipline, whether it's sociology or whether it's any other social science discipline, is a gendered subject or a gendered approach or not. Today, located as we are at this point of historical juncture, it may seem very obvious that yes, all social sciences are gendered. But to take you back, the point where sociology emerged or any of the other social sciences emerged was a point when they were really negotiating with the dominance or hegemony of natural science. So the key question in sociology or any other social science, that you are objective, you are neutral, you are able to observe and reflect society in complete form. If it is scientific and objective, then there is no reason to look at the women's issue separately from any other issue. But the strength of the women's studies perspective was to show that observation was not neutral, that in a certain sense what social science was doing it in a gender blind fashion. If men and women are located differentially in society, then it's very obvious that social science is also differentially located in society.
Yeah. So when you talk about the major sociological theories, we are having the Marxian perspective talking about the social change, then also the class struggle, etc. like this. Then we are having Weberian perspective in understanding society, Durkheim's perspective in understanding the division of labor. Do you want to say that those major sociological perspective in understanding the change and society and societal group has been gender blind?
There is no sort of single answer to that. Maybe I could spend a little bit of time in many of these classical thinkers. They were not gender blind. What was true about them was that they were aware that there is a division of labor in society, a sexual division of labor, but many of them did not pursue it to the extent that they ought to have. Let us take the example of Marx. The whole issue of surplus value extraction is premised on the assumption that the employer or the capitalist is paying the laborer less than what he should be doing, assuming that the reproduction of his food, clothing, welfare will be addressed within the home, the private sphere, by the wife or by the women, which would not be recognized in the general scheme of things. So, the wage which would be offered would be just enough for that minimal reproduction of the labor, and here there is a clear recognition that there is reproduction of labor within the family, within the house, but it is not recognized. Engels, on the other hand, had explicated in this Origin of Family, Private Property and the State. Likewise, if you look at Marx's reserve army of labor, the assumption is that in any society there is a body of labor which is not always used. But when there are crises, this is used, and the most dramatic instance with which all of us are familiar is when you had World War in England, for example, and the men went out to battle the war. Who would man the industries, who would look after the shops, who would take over the government offices, and women were actually called by the state to step in. But the moment the war ended and the men returned, they were said to go back to where they deserved to be. And here you can see a clear demonstration of the reserve army of labor taking place, So, I don't think the classical thinkers exactly did not recognize. Even if you look at somebody like Durkheim, and his whole understanding of division of labor, or even his differentiation of solidarity, there are many possibilities within these classical thinkers from where you can draw upon. Much later, look at somebody like Talcott Parsons, who was so influential in sociology, and his whole AGIL model assumes that the man plays the instrumental role, the woman plays the expressive role, that there is a certain logic of a patrilineal, patriarchal, nuclear family for an industrial society. So, it's not that they were so much gender blind, but what was happening was they were assuming the commonsensical model which existed to be the model upon which they theorized,
Maybe you're exactly correct. The way Miriam Ice talks about this expansion of global capitalism and position of women within that.
Right.
In this context, do you feel there is a necessity, since there is an extension of those perspective, which is already a platform is given by the classical thinkers, there is a need or possibility redefining the pre-existing societal categories, say take into consideration citizenship as a category, or we take into consideration the whole concept of patriarchy, the whole institution of marriage. So, this concept, these categories, these processes, there is a need of redefinition and reconceptualization.
No, definitely there is a need for reconceptualization, Take a very simple example with which a lot of people feel a little uncomfortable. Say many of us now we use he / she. We say history and we say her story. And a simple question which a lot of people would ask is, do you really mean, does it matter? Does it matter whether you say or he or whether you say she? But the point is, it does matter, because when you say he, you actually imagine a he. It's only when you put a she that you imagine a woman. Now, this is important because otherwise we do not look at the experiences of women separately from men, one. Number two, we hierarchize experiences. So, for example, very simple, women's experiences, whether for very long, the private experiences of women, whether it's child rearing, childbearing, cleaning the house, looking after domestic work, a certain kind of diseases associated with women, were not given any kind of significance. You are familiar with in health studies, for a very long time, if a woman was nervous, they would say she's hysterical, and hysteria is something which is a very feminine kind of thing. What was happening was that these experiences were not given the same kind of significance in social sciences and in sociology as, say, men's experiences would be given. Say men's demands within the office space or men's demands regarding voting would be given a great deal of experiences. I'll give you a very simple example. Very often when the first time you had the state giving this maternity, instead of maternity leave, they gave a small token paternity leave. Now, when they gave paternity leave, a lot of people thought it a little ridiculous. But I don't think it's ridiculous, simply because it recognizes that this act of being a father or a mother envisages a lot of work and tasks which has to be publicly recognized. Otherwise, a woman is embarrassed to say in the office that I have to go home early today because the children are coming. They will say she is not serious about her work, you know, she does not devote attention to the public sphere. But the moment you recognize the private sphere as a recognizable object, you know, then the entire meaning of even of your citizenship changes. You know, that this is part and parcel, as important as building a bridge or as any other thing that you're rearing children. You know.
Now, two related issues to it. Number one, in conceptualizing the gender issue and women's issue and articulating certain strategies on the part of the state and civil society to address those issues. Initially, we had a well-defined perspective, social development. Then we talked about the gender and development, then gender in development. Initially started with the women and development, women in development. Now, we are finding a different kind of a change in the vocabulary.
Correct.
But do you feel that this simple change in the vocabulary is sufficient enough without concerted effort on the part of the women themselves to implement those strategies at the grassroots or even in the national level?
Yeah, I think this is a really relevant point, particularly what you mentioned, the WID-WAD-GAD debate, you know. Now, the WID-WAD-GAD debate is really part of the United Nations discourse, you know, and a discourse of the international institutions, you know. Whereas, this is a point that I think we have to really take serious attention to, especially what you mentioned about challenges of globalization, that at one point, the women's studies was very closely linked with the women's movement. The women's movement raised very fundamental questions about the nature in which society was organized, you know, and they had a critique which was not just talking about women and development, but they were talking about the manner in which society is organized as a whole. So, it was a broader kind of perspective. Once it was institutionalized within the international institution discourse, then it became confined to the kind of you know, the slogans that they used for developmental work. So, at this point you go with the WID and then you go with the WAD, then you go with the GAD, you know. But this is, I feel, a limited discourse, and I particularly in the Indian context, where Indian women's studies had a long history, Indian women's movement which had a very long history, a nationalist movement which had very close connections with the women's question. It's important for women's studies practitioners to move away from a discourse which is primarily governed by the international institutions. Not to say that it doesn't have a relevance, but to realize that this is a packaged understanding. It's not enough just a lot of to say WID or GAD, but to question the mode of development. I'll give you a small instance, say, of globalization and the microcredit system and the self-financing group, which has acquired huge kind of you know, currency in contemporary times. And in a common sense, it may seem very empowering for women. But if you locate it in the international institutional discourse, you find that there is something amiss. For example, it coincides with the neoliberal globalization which has taken place. And the argument earlier was that the state has to subsidize marginalized section, including women, social security, health security, etc. In the neoliberal regime, you feel that if the state invests so much, then the country won't develop. So, you have a shift of discourse which says the individual woman is actually a very empowered woman, and instead of the state supporting groups, you can have banks which give credit, because women are very good at repaying. So, you have a shift of discourse which is actually not just about gender. It's actually a broader discourse about economic development and political management, but it acquires a shape of a very neutral professional language of self-finance and microcredit system. And I really feel that women's studies, since it began with an interrogative moment, should not get caught in this framework. You know, I must share with you a small kind of anecdote. I have an ex-student who now works with a very big corporation of an international institution, and she often writes to me that their head who looks after them discusses gender with them, but in earlier time he used to be in a transnational management working on large scale food processing and corporation. So, he shifted the guidance. What I am trying to say is there is an institutionalization and professionalization of gender, where gender is taken out as a small component away from its political, economic, cultural, historical dynamics.
Exactly. I want to just substantiate to what you told, that recently there was one statistics regarding this Bangladesh Gramin Bank.
Right.
Bangladesh Gramin Bank total circulation of the credit, not even 0.2% of the total credit circulated in Bangladesh. So that shows the total state of the affairs in terms of this self-help group we are talking about. Now it raises to this important second point, that there is a hegemonic global kind of a penetration of certain strategies and policies. Simultaneously, we are talking about, and I also largely subscribe to this view, there should be some kind of a localized varieties of the plans and program to be implemented at the grassroots level. Now, women studies, as we understand, it has emerged out of a women's movement. Now, in 60s, late 60s and till mid 70s, there was a talk, women studies should be a tool of indigenizing social sciences, developing new concept theories and perspectives. In this way, do you like to contribute to what kind of theoretical contribution women studies has made in India, especially even in globally? There has been a criticism that there has been a process of feminification of theory, and that is, if it is a global process of feminification of theory, what is the state of women studies today in withstanding the challenges posed by proliferation of several sophisticated theories in other disciplines?
Yeah, I think we are at a crossroad of enormous challenges, because on one hand you have had institutionalization, which are really seeing it as an operationalization of a certain developmental pattern. On the other hand, you have had a proliferation of substandard social science. So you have a large number of women's studies program which are supported precisely because they are substandard, because they lack the interrogative skills of social science. I will give you a very small instance. In the 10th plan document of women's studies in the UGC, women's studies was put in the non-formal sector. The argument being women's studies is about training, skill giving, dance, drama, etc. And it took a lot of resistance to put it back in the 11th plan in the formal sector of academics. So there has been a tendency to move it away from academic research. Particularly in a developing country, in a poor country like ours, there is often a feeling that theory is an indulgence. And if you want to do women's studies, you have to help people. And if you have to help people, you get involved in a project. Why do you theorize? But what happens here is again the dichotomy between theory and empirical research. You cannot do any kind of plan, whether it is IRDP or any developmental or the NRG, unless you have conceptual tools which will help you to understand.
Like this, Now, I mean, coming to the process of articulation of certain issues. Three important issues now worldwide we talked about. One is the issues of political parity, simultaneously the economic and political parity. There has also been a talk about this pro-life and pro-choice. Whether you will go for the pro-choice in terms of deciding your body, your culture, your mind, or you will go for the pro-life to that. And third important issue is that within the whole process, the process of protective discrimination for women. What do you stand in view of these three issues, and what should possibly the major trend of Indian women studies and women's movement in India in terms of political parity, pro-life, pro-choice, and economic parity?
Yeah, I mean, you've asked me probably a whole range of questions, like it's answering about everything. But very briefly, if you talk about political reservation, I think the Panchayat Raj has been a success to a large extent, definitely. And to that I agree that when we talk about localized responses, if we do it in a more innovative fashion, it works. But being aware of the larger work. The reservation issue in Parliament after the recent elections, you are very familiar with, huge resistance. Huge resistance to do it repeatedly. We have seen that happening, and again, the issue of community and other forms of hierarchies come along. So there is a problem there. There is obviously a very sizable section of the population who don't want it. And to that extent, the relevance of women's movement in women's studies resurfaces. When it comes to economic parity, this is a point I've already mentioned, that you have very interesting strands in contemporary times. With globalization, you have the emergence and in a certain sense a valorization of the new individuated woman. Like she's very powerful, she's very capable. It's a very North American kind of model, you know, which is like your whole question of choice. And that same model is then imposed on the poorer sections by saying the poor woman is also a very strong woman. Significantly, some of these programs take on the language and findings of earlier feminist writings to argue a different kind of point. So economically, we are faced with a challenge. You know, you're familiar with the terms of feminization of poverty and feminization of employment. People actually feel that this could be worked out. And the third, the question of choice, I think we'll have to really think about it, because in contemporary times, choice very often becomes market choice rather than a kind of affirmed choice of a group of people.
Now, in articulating gender issue, we understand the media is playing a very big role, and in the process, lot of women, especially the young generation, they are getting alienated. It is talked about from the realities of the societies. Now, do you believe that media is contributing more towards idealizing the womanhood rather than constructing the reality of the society?
That is again a huge question, you know, but I think what we have to recognize that the media does play an enormous role in contemporary times in shaping views, because it's not restricted just to the urban elite. Definitely no, media has enormous reach. Number two is you have diverse strands within the media. On one hand, you have some very realistic kind of programs. You also have glorification and in many cases vilification, where the woman is seen as evil, conspiring, a demon. All strands are existing, and I think it's time for Indian society to grapple with the power of media, because the media has a magical quality. What it presents seems to be the real, you know, and I think as women's studies persons, sociologists, we have to engage with exactly how a media is constituted and what its impact are.
Now that when you were talking about women's studies in general and also the state of women's studies in particular within the discipline of sociology, we encounter varieties of challenges emerging in terms of articulating issues. How will we be articulating issues? Whether we will be articulating afresh or redefining the old issues, and how will be getting conceptualized, how will conceptualize the gender issues altogether. We have addressed many of these questions, and maybe we have tried a lot to incorporate in a small package, and we have tried to involve in this engagement, in this academic engagement. Thank you very much for coming over here, and we believe that we will be again having more series of discussion of these varieties on gender issues and challenges of women's studies especially. Thank you.